Welcome to our virtual panel, a conversation with Dondré Whitfield. My name is Ed Beltran, and I'm the CEO of Fierce, and I'll be today's moderator. Thank you for joining this important conversation with featured guest Dondré, who's a speaker, author, and three-time Emmy and NAACP Image Award nominee. Most recently, you would have seen him on Queen Sugar, produced by Oprah, and on the OWN network. Dondré is a really down-to-earth person and passionate about making a positive impact through his purpose, which you'll learn about more in today's session. He'll share a number of topics that range from manhood, leadership, and parenting. Also to join this conversation will be my colleagues, Susan Scott, author and founder of Fierce, and Gracian Charles Antoine, who's our director of operations. Dondré, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh, brother, thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Awesome. Hey, Dondré, to kick this off for our audience, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and, more importantly, the journey that you've taken to lead you to the manhood movement? Wow.
Well, that's a pretty long one, but I'm going to give you the short version. 35-year veteran of film, television, and theater. I grew up on the streets of Brooklyn, led by a powerful mother who did everything that she could do to make sure that her three boys didn't find the wrong way, and taught me how to be a great human being, full of empathy and who was considerate and responsible, thoughtful. But in the way of my manhood, my father was in and out of jail my entire life. Throughout my adolescence. And so that was really difficult because I didn't have a real manhood drill instructor in my home. And so in banging my head up against life's brick wall, all too often trying to figure out what manhood was all about, I had to steal a bunch of thoughts from different men and created the ideal father for myself. And seeing some of males that I came across in all the years of my development and watching them really cause a lot of havoc. I often say that, as men, when we don't lead properly, we create chaos. And so watching their example of creating chaos made me see that I needed to do a lot of work on myself in order to avoid that once I came into my own manhood. And as an actor of 35 years, I've often said that acting is my passion, but I figured out that activation was my purpose. So that's what led me to write Male versus Man, and what's led me to go around the country trying to get males to matriculate into their manhood.
Thank you, Dondré. And so, that's a really interesting concept, right? So if you think about havoc and chaotic leadership that male leaders have caused, like what you mentioned, you take it a step deeper and you say the real problem, the systemic issue, has to do with the lack of maturation from, and I'll use your words, grown male to manhood, right? Yes. So can you tell us a little bit about this? Why don't all males mature in this same way? And then more importantly, what could we all do? How can we use these principles, all of us, to contribute to stronger relationships and better conversations?
Wow, that's a full conversation there. Males don't all learn the same way because they're not all taught the same way. And one of the reasons why I wrote Male versus Man was because I wanted to create a playbook for manhood. The reason why many of us miss the mark in terms of our manhood is that we're missing some very key ingredients. We're missing the pillars that we build our manhood off of. In the end, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that every man is supposed to be a walking tree of his house and his community. Well, let's look at what a tree is. A tree is the first piece of shelter before we even had houses. When you get under a tree protects you from the harmful elements of the world, right? A tree also provides us oxygen even when we give it back poison in the form of carbon, right? So a tree allows us to be able to breathe better in order for us to live better. A tree also gives us food in the form of fruit. So not only feeding us physically, but as a man, we have to be able to feed our house and our community emotionally and spiritually. So a man is supposed to be the walking tree of his house and his community. Very few of us as males are ever taught that that's our ultimate assignment in life. And so when we were created, that was the intention behind our creation. So if no one ever tells you that you are supposed to be served, then you will walk through life serving yourself. When I talk about this in the book, that every male looks to be served while every man looks to be of service, that is a concept that has to be taught to you and that you have to be held accountable for every single day of your life. And so when we as males matriculating into our manhood understand that that's our assignment, we instantly build greater relationships between the women and children that we're supposed to serve for our entire lives.
That's great. Thank you, Dondré. Next, I'd like to welcome Susan Scott, founder of Fierce and best-selling author of Fierce Conversations.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to be here. Dondré, I loved your analogy of man as a walking tree.
Oh.
Trees are so beautiful. I cannot imagine this world without them. I don't think we'd survive without them. So thank you for that. I had not heard that before.
First of all, thank you for having me in this conversation. And yes, that's one of the reasons why I wanted men to be framed up against what trees are, because to your point, they are essential. As I feel like men are extremely essential in our communities, we just have to know what roles we're supposed to be playing.
Exactly. I love that. Well, you know that that I'm all about the conversation, and
Yes.
That I really believe that our careers, our relationships, and our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. And so while no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career or a relationship or a life, any single conversation can. And I remember reading in your book that you said, a change in trajectory is possible. So I wanted to ask you if you can recall any conversations that were truly significant in your life that perhaps caused you to shift gears, so to speak.
Yeah, and I hesitate in mentioning this one, but I think it's really necessary. Usually I lead with something positive that activates you, but sometimes the negative experience actually activates you in a way where you find something deeply positive in it.
Yes.
One of the profound conversations that I had that I mentioned in the book also was with a fourth grade teacher who told me that I was not a good writer. At the time, I was 10 years old. It's extremely difficult to even think about it and not laugh now, because I was 10 years old at that point. Nothing that you do as a 10-year-old person, male or female, is really truly going to dictate who or what you ultimately become in life. But that conversation was so significant at that point, because when she said that I was not a good writer, it became the infomercial to my life about how I saw myself as a writer. For 4 decades of my life, that was the perception I had about who I was as a writer. Now, notice I use the word perception.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge difference between perception and reality. Your perception becomes your reality when you are truly invested in it. And I was truly invested in that perception. So for 4 decades, that statement assassinated an author.
Oh, yeah.
And truthfully speaking, and many people won't really know this, and so we're sort of letting the cat out of the bag, but it's a great cat. I actually hired a writer to ghostwrite this book for me because I didn't believe that I could write it. So I said to myself, well, I will give the writer my messaging and they will turn it into a book. So this writer wrote 2 chapters, and I read them, and I remember reading them and saying, this is my messaging, but it's not my voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And out of necessity, I sat at this laptop and I began pecking away because I don't type. So I'm pecking. And I pecked away, and all of a sudden, I had these 2 chapters. It was pouring out of me. And I sent them back to the writer, sweating profusely, waiting for their response.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, Dondré, you don't need me to write this book for you because you write better than people I know with letters at the end of their name. And I will never forget how that made me feel.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, you don't need me to help you write this book. And I said, I thank you for this messaging, but I have to respectfully disagree. I do need you to help me with this book. And here's what I need you to do. The loudest voice in your head is the one that wins. I need your voice to supplant the voice in my head that says, I'm not a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
I need you to be the voice, the loudest voice in my head that says, you are a good writer and you're going to do this. And from that day forward, she was like, as a boxer, she became my corner man, taking my mouthpiece out, toweling my face down, giving me water and going, champ, you can do it. Get on out there and be somebody.
I love that. Stephen Sondheim wrote a song called Children Will Listen. And the first line is, be careful what you say. Children will listen.
Yes.
And I love that. It's so important. And, you know, your word assassinate, she assassinated the writer in you. And we just don't even realize. I mean, one of the principles of Fierce Conversations is take responsibility for your emotional wake. Do you want it to be an aftermath, an aftertaste, or an afterglow? You know, it's what people remember after the conversation is over. And so I love that story. I wanted to ask you something else that you wrote that really struck me is you said, when we're born, we look like our daddy. When we die, we look like our decisions. Say something about that.
That, I mean, you know, I often understand that we, as human beings, we have similar experiences, but don't really know it. Because often we don't have the language that truly paints the picture of what our experience is. And so often we go throughout our lives feeling like we don't have similar experiences until we hear something that paints the picture of, oh, wait, that's my experience. And then someone says, that's my experience too. And so what I wanted to do was to choose words that would paint a picture that would allow us all to realize that we're having similar experiences. And that statement about us really looking like our daddy, which is God, and then dying like we look like our decisions really puts it into perspective. That when we're born, because we come straight from God, we look like God. But then throughout our life experience, the world teaches us certain things, and we sometimes get further and further away from our source, which is God. And so ultimately, we begin to die looking like those decisions based on what the world taught us.
Yeah, and what we bought.
What we bought into.
Yeah. So because I know that the people watching this want to know, well, what do I do with this, Dondré? What should I do? What is a piece of advice that you would give us on that topic? What should we do then?
Yes. I often tell folks, like, even in this book, there are great biblical references in this book, but I am not a religious person. I am a spiritual man, and I have used the Bible as my roadmap to manhood. So really, the Bible and my life experience, if you blended those two, and then I poured them into a drink, you get male versus man. And so what I try to understand is that if we look to what that messaging is, those biblical messages that have great life messaging for us, you can lead a great life. The book of Proverbs, if you read that, even if you don't agree with everything that you read in the Bible, if you extract the messaging from the book of Proverbs, you can pretty much lead a good life. One of the reasons why I additionally wrote this book was because I wanted to, it was sort of like Bible juicing. So the person who isn't going to read the Bible, the messaging that comes out of it, and the practical application of what I did in my own life.
Yeah.
When you read Male versus Man, this will go down smoother.
It will, and I loved reading your book. You write actually like I do, which is probably one of the reasons why I liked it so much. You write as if you're just sitting down with someone having a conversation.
Yes.
Maybe you got a campfire going. Maybe you're roasting some s'mores or something, and you're just talking and you're telling stories. Thank you. Thank you so much for this book.
Thank you for that powerful affirmation. I often tell folks that the greatest gift that you can ever give anyone is the gift of affirmation. Mm-hmm. So coming from a writer such as yourself, that is a powerful affirmation. Thank you for that.
All right, I'd like to introduce Gracien Charles Antoine, Director of Operations at Fierce. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Ed, for the lovely introduction. And Dondré, welcome to our Fierce tribe. We obviously read your book, love the content, love the messaging, and it's our pleasure to be working with you on this journey of male to manhood. As you and I have talked before, I'm a father of two boys, 9-year-old and 13-year-old, very avid soccer fan. And one of the questions that come to mind often for me is, how am I setting them up to be contributing members of our community, of our society? What tips would you have for me?
Well, teaching our boys how to properly matriculate into men seems like a daunting task because, again, most folks don't know what to teach them. And usually we don't know what to teach them because we usually weren't taught those things ourselves. But where I, would lead off in that conversation is just getting them to understand that now and forever, they will be the firefighters of their home and their community. And by that, I mean that there are going to be people around them mm-hmm. in their adolescence. And once they become men, there are going to be people around them constantly setting fires, constantly creating chaos. And as men, our job is to find a way to be calm in the midst of that chaos and to find a way to put out the fire that the arsonists, the males, the grown males, constantly start.
Mm-hmm.
As a husband and as a father of two, a father of five if you count my pets, which I do. But as the leader of my home, I'm constantly looking to put out the fires that are set in my home and the fires that are set outside my home. And so if I am constantly looking at myself as a firefighter and not a fire starter,
Yeah.
that puts into perspective, number one, that I am constantly looking to be of service, which is what we talked about earlier in terms of what a man is supposed to be, and not a male who looks to be served. When you look to serve yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you will inadvertently start fires because everything is about you and not about those that are around you. And so if I sit there and I strike a match and then I throw that down because I'm looking to serve myself, I'm now unconscious of the fact that someone is going to have to put out the fire that I just inadvertently started because I was unconscious enough to throw down that match.
Yeah.
And so having the conversation with your boys at 9 years old and 13, and, you know, I know that many people will say, well, Dondré, don't you think that's a bit early to have a conversation with a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old about how responsible they have to be in being the firefighter and not the fire starter? Well, watch this. You mentioned the fact that your boys are avid soccer fans, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How early did you begin putting a soccer ball in front of your boys? How old were they?
As soon as they could walk.
Exactly. Right? So no one ever talks about how it's too early to put a soccer ball, a basketball, a football, a baseball in front of our boys, but now they want to question how early it is to begin talking about messaging of manhood. Well, that's a complete contradiction in terms. And that speaks directly to why we have great athletes who don't have great men.
Nope. Because service. Serve me.
Period. And that there is no time that's too early to begin having a conversation with our boys about how important it is for them to grow into manhood, right? And I often draw this analogy whenever I'm speaking to young males. Usually, when I go throughout the country, I figure out what their favorite sport is, and often it's basketball.
Yeah.
And so I say, okay, tell me who your favorite basketball players are. And the usual suspects come up: the Kobes, the LeBrons, the Magics, right? And so it's the usual suspects. And I say, tell me what they all had in common. And they all say the same thing. They had talent. They had perseverance. They were strong. They had drive. All of these things. And I said, that's absolutely true. But you're leaving out one thing. And they all look to each other. It's all the same quizzical look. What did we miss? What did we miss? And I said, they all had great coaches. In order for you to become a great basketball player, you need to have great coaching. So if we know that you need to have great coaching in order to become a great basketball player, then why do we think we don't need great coaching to become a great man?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. That helps. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I love the firefighter versus the fire starter analogy, because I think it is so relevant to, look out for people. Be the firefighter. Don't go start a fight, we're told, but
absolutely.
Don't go start the fire.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for that. Continuing on this, can you help our audience with concrete steps males can take to become men? Because your book lays it out whether it's talking with the scriptures, whether it's how we can help our boys in sports develop the mentality of serving themselves, like carry your own bag, make your own water bottle for your practice. What other steps can you give us that would help our audience here?
Well, what's interesting about this man building process is understanding first that we are servants, first and foremost, and always. And then trying to figure out the difference between my passion and my purpose. I have a great many passions. Scuba diving is a passion. Horseback riding is a passion. I know that sounds strange coming from a boy who grew up in Brooklyn.
I thought you were going for a motorcycle.
It used to be a passion before I had children. Right? So all of these things are great passions of mine. Golf is a great passion. Acting, in fact, is a great passion, but it's not my purpose. My passion serves me. My purpose serves others.
Good point.
So in the midst of all of that, my job is to figure out what was God's intention for my life when he created me as a servant, because that's going to be my purpose. So earlier I mentioned the fact that acting is my passion, but activation is my purpose. So every single day, my job when I wake up is to figure out how I can activate someone. That's my purpose. That's why God put me here. It literally is the thing that allows me to never be tired. If you put me in front of people and I know they need to be activated, if I'm dead tired, I can have a boost of energy that will carry me for hours on end, as long as I have someone in front of me that I know needs to be activated. That is purpose. When we come into that, it opens up the rest of our lives, right? And I know that your next question is going to be, well, Dondré, how do we find our purpose? I knew you were going to ask me that. I knew it.
Was that a good question?
Is that the title of your next book?
Yeah. Call it being clairvoyant, call it whatever you want. But I knew you were going to ask that question. Okay, so here's how we get to that. I wrote Male versus Man because it is a part of my work, my purpose work. Figuring out how to get to your purpose is going to be figuring out what you're in pain about. Your pain, yes, your pain will inform your purpose. So not having my father in my life, not having my father in my life to teach me how to matriculate into manhood was extremely painful. Having my father kidnap me at the age of 6 years old, having my father at 12 years old teach me the lesson about how he would tell me that he loved my mother and that he would do anything for her, but in the very next breath would look out of his driver's side window and catcall out to a woman. Now, while he didn't tell me, the messaging that I got from that was, you can love one woman, but lust after many. So at 12 years old, when you get that messaging from your father, that for me began or started my trajectory as a cheater. Right? So all of those things created great pain in me about not having my father play the role that God intended him to play. But here's what I began to figure out when I began matriculating into my own manhood.
Yeah.
that my father couldn't teach me what he was never taught.
Mm.
And so as a man, my job now with my father was not so much to play a role as a son to my father, but to be the brother to my father that he needed in order to help him matriculate into his own manhood.
Earlier, you talked about how we share the same stories. And when you hear someone, you go like, yeah, I lived that.
Yes.
That's the moment I just had right there with you about my own father and how I decided to, I don't know what happened, but I know it's not going to repeat itself. I know I'm not going to give that example to my boys.
Now watch this, Gracien, and this is why I knew, based on the way you talked about your sons,
Yeah.
that either one or two things happened. Either you had a dynamic example from a father in your own life about what a father was supposed to be, or you were at a deficit and you vowed that you would not do that to your sons.
Exactly.
So for me, the key was being able to understand that instead of seeing my father like the 70-year-old version of himself that put me at a deficit, my job was to see my father not as the 70-year-old version of himself, but the 7-year-old version of himself that didn't get what he needed in order for him to matriculate into his manhood.
Absolutely.
Right. And then understanding that the pain that I had from my father not playing the role that I needed him to play in my life, that pain began to inform my purpose.
Right. Yep.
Right. So if I knew that I was in pain about my father and that there were other males in pain about their father, and that left them at a deficit in matriculating into their manhood, my job was to write a book called Male versus Man that would serve as the playbook for manhood so that they could properly matriculate into their manhood.
No. And
see how it all ties together?
It all ties together. Thank you.
So in the evening when I go to sleep, it's the last thing that I think about, and in the morning, it's the first thing that I think about.
Mm-hmm.
When I woke up this morning, I was immediately charged because I knew that we were going to have this moment.
Yes.
And in having this moment, me as in my purpose work, that I would have the opportunity to activate someone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right? At 4 a.m., I woke up at 4 a.m. this morning in order to see my wife and my daughter off because they were going to be leaving to go to New York. I've been up since 4 a.m. this morning. But I'm charged like I just woke up because I know that this is going to activate someone. I'm in my purpose. I know that I'm doing what I was intentioned to do when I was created. So in finding what our purpose is, that's how we unlock our entire lives.
No, that's great advice. And I, for one, I'm following that. There are moments when you see the clarity. There are moments where you're like, I'm on the right path. And
yes.
There's no stopping me.
Yes. Every single day as a man, the question that I'm asking myself is this: am I affecting my environment, or is my environment infecting me?
Yeah.
Males are constantly infecting their environment. Men affect their environment to treat the infection.
Very powerful. Thank you.
Dondré, I would love to explore some of these just a little bit deeper. You said something that I think was very interesting, right? Because you hear this in youth, and we probably said it many times ourselves, which is, finding the faults of what our parents did, right? But what I heard from you was pretty powerful, which is empathy for what your father didn't get, right?
Yes.
And you didn't say this, but I mean, you did build this case of saying, he may have done the best that he possibly can, right? And then it's our responsibility to really recognize the dysfunction that we want to stop. I think it's an important message, Dondré, and I was hoping you could tell us just a little bit more about that, because I think that's so important in how people move forward in a positive trajectory when they have every reason not to.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the powerful statement of hurt people is a very true thing. So if I was, and I think that for some very specific moments in my life, that I was a hurt person hurting other people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I really came into my manhood, I realized that, like, I'll give you an example. And at 26 years old, I was on a show at that time called All My Children. It's back in New York. For all intents and purposes, many people at that point, you know, consider me a success story coming out of the environment that I grew up in Brooklyn, and by that time, you know, really having my feet be wet in the entertainment industry, and having this, you know, 3-year contract, you know, on this staple show on television. For an actor, being on a daytime television show is the closest thing that you'll ever have in having a 9-to-5 job, because it's constant work. So I had this 3-year contract. First person in my family to buy, you know, a house. First person in my family to buy a car. And I had this beautiful, expensive luxury car. And I decided that I was going to go find my father, who had just been recently released from prison. And I went and I picked him up. And we drove around for a little while. And I proceeded to tell him about my pain that he caused. And at the end of that conversation, I told my father that if I ever saw him again, that one of us wouldn't be here, and it wasn't going to be me. I actually said it a little differently than that, but I don't speak that way anymore, so you'll have to fill in your own blanks. But that was a very powerful conversation that I had with my father, and I threatened my father, which was crazy because, you know, here it is, this man who had gone to jail for some very violent crimes. And here I was threatening him with violence. What I wanted to show him was I had made a success out of my life. And because he had caused me so much pain, I wanted to cause him pain. I wanted to show him that his son had made it despite what he hadn't contributed to my life. And in threatening him, I knew that that would cause him even greater pain. 20 years had passed, and my daughter came and sat next to me one day on the couch and asked me a very simple question. She said, "Dad, do you know where your father is?" I immediately knew that God was sending me a messenger that I couldn't shoo away. And so after I asked her to turn up the air conditioning because I felt hot, I answered her and I said, yeah, I didn't know where my father was. And she asked some more simple questions. And she never judged any of my feeble answers. She just received them. And the last 2 questions she asked me was, is that my grandfather? And am I ever going to meet him? What she was really saying to me was, listen, whatever problem you have with this man is your problem, but you're cheating me out of a grandparent. And I knew that I had to patch things up with my father. I flew back to Brooklyn a couple months after that, had one of the most powerful exchanges I'll ever have with another human being. What I realized was, while my father and I are of two different faiths, we are two men of faith. And in forgiving him and in being his brother, instead of trying to figure out how I was going to be his son, we developed a great bond. And that began to be something that I will forever have as something that matriculated me further into my manhood. And I talk about that because we have to deal with our pain in order to further understand what our purpose is. Mm-hmm. And if we don't deal with our pain will deal with us. Mm-hmm. And we will forever be those people who are hurt trying to hurt other people. So I really want people to focus on what they're in pain about, what they're hurting about, and deal with those things so that they don't deal, with them, and that they understand truly what their purpose is in dealing with whatever they're truly in pain about.
Thank you, Dondré. It's a very powerful story. And thank you for sharing the story about your father and that relationship arc. So,
an important one in my life.
Yeah, no doubts. Absolutely. So, Dondré, before we go to the audience's question and answer, I wanted to ask you one more question relating to children, right? So you're obviously a positive person. We've had many conversations, follow you on social. And I'm just curious, when you're in this maturation period and you're in this positive zone, and you're in an environment like we're in today, our macroeconomic environment, which many can argue is pretty challenging, right? On many levels, what is it that you can communicate to your kids to stay in that servant leadership role and stay in that positive state while still being authentic to what is happening?
Well, staying in that state, with everything that's happening around us, can be extremely challenging because, we're experiencing these, microaggressions that create great trauma for us at times because they're constant. Mm-hmm. And so after a while, when you experience these, you begin to feel like you want to lash back out in the way that people are lashing out against you. Mm-hmm. And again, getting back to that whole notion of, hurt people, hurting other people, we have to constantly remind ourselves that we are the firefighters and not the fire starters. It really is like the go-to. There are often times where in the book, I talk about how there are two versions of myself, Brooklyn Dre and Disciple Dondré. Right. And that Brooklyn Dre is constantly trying to represent me. And I have to make sure that I keep him, behind me. Get thee behind me, Satan. Because it's easy for us. And let me break it down to you in this way. Brooklyn Dre is the flesh version of myself. Disciple Dondré is the spiritual version of myself. So whenever I allow the fleshy version of myself to lead, there's always trouble. Mm-hmm. There's always trouble. Every decision that I've ever made, I'm going to say that again. Every decision I have ever made where I allowed my flesh to make it always ended badly. Mm-hmm. Always ended badly. It never fails. There's never been a great decision that I've made in my life leading from my flesh. Never. So whenever I feel like my flesh is taking over, I have to stop and breathe, sequester myself, whether that's like closing a door in a room that I'm in or going outside and like be at one with nature, sitting and praying, sitting and just meditating, whatever that is, I have to get in touch with the spiritual version of myself, which is disciple Dondré, and say, okay, whoa, where are we supposed to be going right now? It's kind of like the spiritual version of ourselves is our compass. It's the one that if we allow ourselves to sit still long enough, the compass will show us where we are. When we're in our flesh, we're constantly moving. And so we don't sit still long enough for the compass to even be able to set and recalibrate itself in order for us to know what direction we're supposed to be going in. So we never pay attention to the spiritual compass. We're constantly going from our flesh, and that's just like grasping for straws. It's constant chaos. We have to allow ourselves to be calm, to be still long enough for the recalibration of the compass in order to say, oh, that's where we're supposed to go. I love that. It never fails. Whenever I allow myself to be still long enough for the recalibration to happen, good things happen. Always. Always.
Thank you, Dondré. That's very helpful, especially in our current environment. And right, stay still, reset, recalibrate, and you'll get clarity. So thank you.
Indeed.
This conversation has been lively, and Dondré, obviously very passionate about this, and it comes through. And you actually addressed a lot of our audience's questions, but there is one that we didn't address that I actually think has a lot to it, and I would love for you to walk us through this. So we talked a lot about the role of a man in raising boys, but we haven't talked a lot about opposite roles of a man raising a daughter. So you have a daughter. So I was hoping you can talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, I have made some pretty controversial statements. They actually excite me when I make controversial statements because I know that it evokes thought, right? And what I want to do is I want to shift some things that our society has bought into that we should divest in and begin to reinvest in some concepts that I think are really going to help our communities. And one of those is the notion that a woman, take my mother, for example. As I said earlier, my mother taught me how to be a great human being. And I'm certain that got a few people to scratch their heads at home going, what do you mean a great human being? Don't you mean a great man? Well, being a great human being, those ingredients are key in turning me into the man that I've ultimately become. But specifically speaking, my mother couldn't teach me how to be something she was not. So let me point it out to you. And I know that there are people on the other side now that are completely on fire right now. What do you mean? All right, so let's reverse engineer this for a second. My daughter, who just turned 16, can I really teach her how to be a woman? Now that sounds ridiculous, right? Now that sounds ridiculous because now we look at it in looking at it through this filter. We know that it's ridiculous for a man to be able to teach a young lady how to be a woman. Why? I can't teach my daughter how to be something I'm not. I have no idea. I have no earthly idea what it's like to navigate this world as a woman. I can be empathetic about her experience, but that's not the same thing. So if I didn't have my wife in my life, if I didn't have her as a partner in order to teach our daughter how to become a woman, I'd have to call on the many women that are a part of my life. I'd have to say, Auntie Susan, I'm dropping Parker off to you from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. I need you to do what you do. I need you to do what you do. And then on Saturday, I'm going to drop her off to you again. Why? Because I need for her to learn how to be something I am not. There's no way for me to teach a soldier how to be ready for war, and I've never been a soldier myself. Another soldier has to teach a soldier how to be a soldier in order to be prepared for the battles ahead, right? And so for me, my contribution to my daughter, while I can't teach her how to be a woman, I can teach her how to be a woman who knows how to be in relationship with a man. Why? Because I am a man. I can teach her how to be in relationship with one. I can teach her what kind of language activates or deactivates a man. Why? Because I'm a man. So every single day, my daughter and I, the conversations that we have, the interactions that we have, this serves as her dress rehearsal in understanding how to be in relationship with a man. Crucial piece of her development, right? Crucial piece, because the way she communicates with her girlfriends may not necessarily be a great way to communicate with the man that she ultimately becomes partnered with. Right? So let me put it to you in this space. Ed, you and I could have a conversation as two men, and that conversation could be very gruff. Gracien could come in, and he could be the third wheel in that conversation. And we might have some conversation because we are naturally hunters. We could have a very gruff conversation, but then have that same conversation with Susan. Not such a great idea. Not such a great idea, right? So now we have to tap into the language that allows us to be able to have a loving and great conversation with our sister that may not be the same conversation that the three of us would have together. So we have to have different conversations. It's like being bilingual. So the conversations that I have with Ed or I have with Gracien is not the same loving conversation I'm going to have with my wife. I could say, Ed, man, shut up. Can you imagine me saying that to my wife? Not really. Not a great idea. I have to learn how to be bilingual. So I'm teaching my daughter another language so that she can be bilingual and have that language with the man that she ultimately becomes partnered with. Make sense?
Thank you, Dondré.
Yes, indeed.
Appreciate that. Really lively discussion.
Love it.
Dondré, thank you for this. I am positive that what you have shared with us today is going to provoke some conversations out there that are going to be really interesting, very real, and very fierce. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dondré, for elevating this fierce conversation with us. You're doing amazing and impactful work that's making a difference. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. We'll be hosting a number of events such as this, elevating the conversations that need to be had. Please join our Conversations Catalyst program for key updates, including ones relating to Dondré's message and partnership with Fierce. Until next time, thank you.